Welcome to this presentation about the Gay Activists Alliance, and in particular, Manchester GAA. I'm Paul Fairweather. I came to Manchester in 1978 to work for the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, CHE, then the main gay rights organisation, and I've been active in a whole range of LGBT activities since then. In the first half of the 1980s, I was working as the worker at the Lesbian and Gay Centre. In the second half of the 1980s, I worked for Manchester City Council as one of their gay men's officers. And also at that time, I was involved in setting up and being part of the Mancunian Gay Collective, which is featured in the presentation. And in more recent years, I've also really interested in LGBT history, and in particular, local LGBT history. What I want to do in this presentation is talk a bit about how gay activists came about, why it was formed, how we actually operated as an organisation, some of our national campaigns, but in particular, I want to focus on the work of Manchester GAA, which for a number of years was a very active local campaigning group. So what is Gay Activists Alliance? It was founded in 1978 because there'd been a major attack on Gay News, which in those days was the main gay publication. And Mary Whitehouse, who was a moral campaigner, against lots of gay issues, actually had taken Gay News to court because they'd published a poem which she said was blasphemous. The court agreed with her, and there was a huge national demonstration in London to actually mobilise and get lesbian and gay people and their allies to actually support what was seen as a very serious attack on the gay community. Following that demonstration, a group of people got together in Birmingham at the Lesbian and Gay Centre in Birmingham and decided that we needed to form a national group, the main focus of which would be campaigning and lobbying. And Manchester started a very active group as then. And one of the key aims of Gay Activists Alliance was to secure basic human rights, dignity and freedom for all gay people. And in the late 70s, you could lose your job for being gay, you could be denied services, there was no gay marriage. There were relatively few people who were open about their sexuality, and the gay scene and gay organisations were actually not that strong. Until 1967, for gay men, it had been completely illegal to be gay. So for those of us growing up in the 50s and 60s, it was still a very difficult time. And this is actually a photograph of the National Gay News Defence Committee's big march in London, which I was on. At that time, it was the largest demonstration for gay rights. And we had a whole range of organisations, not just lesbian and gay organisations, but trade unions, the Labour Party, voluntary sector groups came. And it was very much a demonstration in support of free speech, as well as lesbian and gay rights. And actually the demonstration finished with a big rally in Trafalgar Square. Tom Robinson, singer at the time, sang his song Glad to Be Gay, which was one of the very popular songs at the time. And afterwards, actually, a whole group of people actually invaded the WHSmiths in Charing Cross, because the other campaign at the time was a campaign against WHSmiths, which was then the main bookstore, and it refused to actually stop Gay News. So this is a photograph taken by my friend Terry Waller, who was actually at that lobby, and it's Gay Activists Alliance banner. This is London Gay Activists Alliance, one of many local groups, and they're actually lobbying and picketing the Smiths in Notting Hill. We encourage people not to shop in Smiths. We encourage people to sign a petition saying that Smiths should actually stock Gay News. So I want to talk a bit about how Gay Activists Alliance was actually organised and some of the national campaigns that we did. We had meetings every 2 months, national meetings every 2 months, which was actually quite a lot looking back. But I think we used them also, as well as to support each other, it was a friendship network. It was a developing network of lesbian and gay activists up and down the country. Each local group took turns to produce a newsletter. On the left-hand side, you see the first newsletter that Gay Activists Alliance organised. It talks about why we set up, How we chose the name, we had a big debate about what name to call. There was the Gay Activist Alliance in America as an activist group, but we thought about a number of aims, and basically we thought the Gay Activist Alliance was the name that best described what we wanted to do. In the middle, you can see a telephone tree, which again, many younger people may have no idea what a telephone tree was. But in the days pre-internet, pre-mobile phones, if we wanted quickly to contact people, you looked at the list who was on the telephone tree, and the person at the top of the tree would phone the next person, and they'd phone the person. It would continue. So it was meant to be quite an effective way of actually getting information to a much wider group of people. You can see my name there. I think I was probably top of the telephone tree in Manchester. So if it was a local campaign, someone would phone me and I would phone everyone. I would phone the next person and so forth. But we also used it nationally to get information relatively quickly across to everyone in the GAA network about what campaigns we were organising. And the final leaflet you can see is a leaflet about gays against fascism. One of the things that's striking to me today is actually the quality of the leaflets that we produce, but it was all done with letraset on Gestetner machines. So again, it was actually the quality wasn't very high. This for the time is quite a good quality. We use it red as well as black, and there's quite an interesting cartoon there. And Gays Against Fascism was one of the national campaigns of Gay Activist Alliance. It was a time where the National Front was growing in strength as a fascist organisation, and as well as black people, they were also targeting lesbians and gay men. So we were very clear to remind people of the threat that fascism had posed to lesbian and gay people in Germany in the 1930s. And we also linked into the Anti-Nazi League, which was the main campaigning group nationally. And there were several big demonstrations in London, huge anti-fascist demonstrations, and Gay Activist Alliance. Many local Gay Activist Alliance groups went on those marches. I remember marching with GAA at a huge anti-Nazi League demonstration in London that finished in Victoria Park with lots of bands and speeches. So again, one of the national things all the local groups were involved in was campaigning against the National Front and to make people in the gay community more aware of the dangers of fascism. I'll now talk about a number of different campaigns that the group was involved in Manchester. We met very regularly, and actually the bulk of our activities were campaigning that often involved a picket or a zap or a lobby. So sometimes we seem to like picket everything that moved, really. But this is a good example. There was a bar in Didsbury called the Cavalcade, which had become a gay bar on a Sunday. And then it changed hands, and the new owners of the Cavalcade refused to let gay people into the bar. So for many Sundays, we stood outside the bar, handed out this leaflet. We said, go in and buy a drink, show that we have the right to go where we want and when we want. But again, it was actually very difficult. There was no protection. These days, it's illegal to refuse to serve people because of their sexuality or gender identity. In those days, there was no protection. There was a lot of hostility. And again, we tried to make sure that as gay people, we had a right to socialise where we did. So that was one campaign. Another major campaign was against Hulme Labour Club, the No Queers Here campaign. If you look at the leaflet on the left, we'd actually overheard a member of the club saying they didn't want any queers there. We'd applied to run a gay disco, and actually it got turned down when they realised it was going to be a gay disco. The Labour Club was very separate from the Labour Party, so the Labour Party had no real control over it. So for many, many weeks, we actually stood outside the club with our banner, handed out leaflets, encouraged people not to go in and use the club, and encouraged people, if they're in the Labour Party, to ask their local branches to support us and send motions of resolution. At that time in Manchester, it was a Labour council, but it was a very right-wing Labour council. And a few years after GAA, when GAA finished as an organisation, quite a few of us got involved in the Labour Party and were active in the Labour Party throughout the 1980s. And by 1985, Graham Stringer, now the MP for Blakely, became the leader of the council. and the council had a very radical policy in terms of lesbian and gay equality. As I say, from 1985 to 1990, I was one of 2 gay men's officers working within the council. But this campaign of GAA is probably the first example of lesbians and gay men raising the issue inside the Labour Party, talking to people about our experiences, and actually encouraging them to support lesbians and gay men, both inside and outside the Labour Party. So it was quite an important campaign. And again, every Friday, I think for months and months, we actually picketed outside the Labour Club. We were supported by non-gay people. There's quite a few non-gay people who are members of the Labour Party who I can see on the photograph inside there. The slide on the left tells the story of Mary Winter, who was a lesbian bus driver in Burnley, who was sacked for wearing a lesbian liberation badge. She refused to take the badge off and she lost her jobs, and she got very little support from her trade union. At that time, it was completely legal to sack people because of their sexuality. There was no employment protection. But Mary was involved with a women's group in Burnley, and she organised to get her job reinstated. I remember going from GAA to go to the Trades Council meeting in Burnley, which is a group of different trade unions, and went to support Mary Winter to talk about her case and to talk how important it was for trade unions to support her. And many GAA groups across the country actually lobbied. They wrote to the bus company, they wrote to a trade union. So it was quite a high profile national campaign to actually illuminate a case. A few years ago, I was working in Burnley on an LGBT history project funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, and I set up an LGBT heritage trail in Burnley, and the bus station features on that. There was also a play a few years ago about Mary's case, and again that was performed in Burnley. And after the play, we all went outside, the members of the audience, and stood outside the bus station in imitation of this demonstration there. So again, quite an important national campaign, and a campaign that Manchester GAA was involved in. And on the right-hand side, it's a campaign to picket the Greek consulate. Again, this was a national campaign. The Greek government at the time was trying to attack gay men, was saying it was an illness, was saying that we need psychiatric treatment. So again, up and down the country, local groups of GAA would actually organise pickets of different organisations, really. So really make sure that we actually got the message across that in other parts of the world, there was greater discrimination against lesbian and gay people than there was in the UK at that time. The next slide talks about our campaign against Chief Constable James Anderton, who was an extremely homophobic Chief Constable. In 1978, the police raided Napoleon's Club in the gay village, one of the longest established gay clubs in the country, and they used an obscure bylaw called licentious dancing, which was used to stop 2 men or 2 women dancing together. And they used it as a way to try and actually prevent the club from operating. James Anderton was an evangelical Christian. He said he regularly got phone calls from God telling him to close down clubs in the gay village. And it reflected an extremely homophobic police service at the time. It was very difficult to be openly lesbian or gay in the police service. The police didn't treat homophobic hate crime at all seriously. If you were attacked and beaten up in the gay village or outside any gay venues, you probably wouldn't have gone to the police because they might also try to arrest you for other things. For the age consent of gay men was still 21. There was very little public support for gay people. So it was a much more hostile environment than we have today. The leaflet on the left-hand side is from the Stop Anderton campaign, which was a group of organisations, including GAA, because the constable was also attacking the black community, attacking trade unionists. So there was quite a broadly based campaign to have greater accountability for James Anderton as Chief Constable. And on the right-hand side, you can see an article that I wrote for Mancunian Gay magazine about him leading a moral backlash. And one of the main activities that GAA did James Anderton was speaking at an evangelical Christian rally at the Free Trade Hall, and a group of gay activists went. We dressed up as man and woman and went in dressed very respectably. And then, in imitation of what the suffragettes had done at the Free Trade Hall, we unfurled a banner proclaiming gay rights and disrupted the rally. And we had a very violent response from people. People threw their Bibles at us. We were bundled out by the bouncers. But again, that got a lot of local publicity. It was quite an effective campaign to highlight Anderton's anti-gay remarks. And later in the decade, he went on, during the height of the AIDS epidemic, he talked about gay men swirling in a cesspit of their own making. This was echoed recently by Russell T Davies in his programme It's a Sin, about gay life in the 1980s, where another police officer talks about that. But again, these days there's been huge changes. The police service nationally is much more supportive. You have lots of LGBT people openly working for the police service. But I think it's important to remember that in the late 70s, early 1980s, it was very homophobic, but Chief Anderton in particular was an extremely homophobic chief constable. So looking back at this time, I wanted to include a quote. This is an article that I wrote for the Gay Activist Alliance newsletter, number 7. And it says we've gained a certain recognition in Manchester that the group can be effective. Because I think for a while we had quite a strong group. We ran lots and lots of campaigns that got a lot of positive publicity in the local press. And also we began to involve more people in gay activism. And for me, at the time, the solidarity and enthusiasm of those GAA meetings and activities had been the most exciting and encouraging experience of gay activism to date. What did we achieve? I think what was important was the need to do direct action. These days, it's maybe less direct action than there used to be, but I still think while you also need to do other forms of lobbying and campaigning in terms of writing to people, having discussions with people, I think there's still a role for direct activism, confronting people when they are anti-LGBT. So I think it's really important to do that. But also to remember there was a whole group of activists who were actually spent a lot of time and energy actually organising that campaign. So if we move on to the final slide, which simply says, remember the zap and the picket can change the world. Thank you. And if you're going to hang around, we're now going to do a Q&A involving both some other members of Gay Activists Alliance and some friends of mine who were very much around in the late 70s, early 80s. And I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion with them about their memories of gay activism in those days. I'd also really like to thank Superbia for supporting me doing the work and research on this presentation through their many commissions, and in particular Greg for all his support and encouragement, and also for Emma for making my presentation look absolutely brilliant. And so thank you very much to Emma and Greg.
My name's Greg Thorpe. I'm the project manager for Superbia, which is the arts and culture programme for Manchester Pride, and we programme and support LGBT projects all year round. This project is part of the Superbia Spotlights, which has been running almost since the beginning of the pandemic. And using generous funding from Arts Council England, we've been able to support around a dozen projects for artists and activists to make pieces of work, mostly at home, for people to experience at home. And we're very excited about this particular project because we're hoping it's the beginning of a longer delve into the archival work around the Gay Activists Alliance and other projects that Paul Fairweather has been involved in over the years. That presentation, I'm sure, was just the tip of a very exciting iceberg of work and memories. And we're excited to support Paul to do more of this archival work. And we're joined on this event by 5 special guests, friends, colleagues, comrades of Paul's from over the years. And I think the best way to lead into the conversation is for me to go around and to welcome each of you and ask you to introduce yourself and to talk about what your involvement with GAA, the Gay Activist Alliance, was, and perhaps reflect on the presentation that you've just seen a little. and then we'll lead in with some more conversations, but I'm sure there's plenty of memories and anecdotes to be had. So I'll just start in the order on my screen. So Andrew Lowrey, if we can go to you first. Hello, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, hello, hi. Yeah, my name's Andrew Lowrey. I'm a bit of an imposter, actually, because as you can almost certainly see from the image on your screen, I'm far too young to have been around in Manchester during the GAA activist. I arrived in Manchester just after the period Paul was talking about, around about 84, and was involved with Switchboard, with the Gay Centre, and later I was the first paid editor of Mancunian Gay and Gay Life magazine. And then I moved into the media, sort of mainstream media, as they think they call it these days. But and left Manchester. But I was very much around, sort of in that period from sort of the early 80s to the early 90s.
Terrific, thank you, Andrew. And Terry, welcome. And can you introduce yourself, please?
My name's Terry Waller. I'm in Manchester. My involvement in Gay Activists Alliance was via living in London at the time. So I was a member of the London group, and we certainly picketed many WHSmith shops and the Greek embassy there. And I was working intermittently, so I had quite a lot of time to contribute to it. And Paul's very interesting presentation reminded me of so many things, including, sadly, some of our friends have passed on, of course. But there were some real grafters. And initially, I was around the North London Gay Centre, and we worked closely with Brixton Gay Centre, and many of the most active people in the London Gay Activists, London Gay Activists Alliance were from there.
Terrific. Thank you for that introduction, Terry. And we'll go to John next, please.
Hi, yeah. I came down from university at Preston in 74, and then I can't quite remember who invited me to join Switchboard that was being formed. I seem to remember in December of 74, and so I volunteered for them, and then I volunteered as a counsellor for Friends, counselling group. I think I was what's the phrase? A camp follower. I saw everything going on. People like John Shires, Paul Fairweather, Liz Stanley, and I was just amazed by what was going on. I didn't know very much about what they were doing, so I went along to meetings and just tried to bring myself up to date. I mean, I continued doing the counselling work, and I did a course at the university after that. And then I was eventually on the board of the LGF for 15 months, I think, before I resigned. And then I'm still involved even now in the Gay Village and little projects. So
great, thank you so much, John. And we'll go to Anne next, please.
Hi. Yeah, I'm in Manchester as well. I got involved. I'm not sure exactly when. Did we used to meet in that little pub by Shude Hill?
Yeah, the Lower Turk's Head we used to meet in.
The Lower Turk's Head, yes, that was. Yeah. I couldn't remember the name of it. Yeah, people keep mentioning John Shires. I was a mature student at college in Wythenshawe, and he was one of my sociology tutors. And I actually came out to him, and I mean, before I'd had a chance to turn around, he'd whipped me down to Friend, and said, you need to come down and be on the phone. And so I just got involved in things. We had the we had 2 rooms in what was it called? Something Place. We had 2 rooms, one for Switchboard and one for Friend. And then eventually we ended up getting the Cellar. There'd been a music company there, and they moved out, and we got the Cellar. And so we also got some sort of grant, which I think in the for the work he did was actually down to John Cotterill.
Exactly, yeah.
He bombarded the city council with letters and phone calls, and and we ended up getting our first grant, which I think was £6,000.
Yeah, 6.5.
And which meant we could set up a separate helpline for lesbians, which was excellent. But it was a horrible time in terms of being gay in lots of ways, obviously. But I sort of, once I came out, and I actually became the sort of go-to lesbian mother. If they wanted anything about lesbian mothers, and Algar will do it, So that's so my kids were brought up on it. I mean, Paul babysat for my two daughters many a time, so I could go to women's meetings and things. But what I remember is the fun. We'd go into WHSmith, we do some shopping, get a little basket full of stuff, go to the till, and then say to them, can I have a copy of Gay News? And they'd say, no, you can't, it's banned, you can't, And then we'd say, right, well, I don't want this stuff, thank you very much, and walk out. And it was fun. We picketed the Daily Express building, or we invaded the Daily Express building. I was on the James Anderton thing at the town hall, at the Free Trade Hall. And so, but what I remember now, I could say, is the fun that we had. It was all serious and it needed to be done, but it was fun. I mean, I've actually, that first march that Paul was talking about, I think I've got a picture of him in pink tights. on that march, so
that will be going into the archive.
I actually think we're wearing them now. Just tilt your screen down a little bit, Paul.
I mean, I did work. I worked for about 10 years in Lesbian Link. I was one of the paid workers, and obviously counselled lots of women. We did my partner at the time. We did a film for Channel 4 called Breaking the Silence, about lesbian mothers, and like I say, my daughters were brought up with it. My younger daughter at the moment, her profile picture on Facebook is her and her younger sister, her older sister rather, with Glyn, who people here will know. When we were painting the gay centre, the first one, it was opposite in New York. So, and they've got a picture of them together. So
fantastic. Thanks, Anne. That's a wonderful overview and introduction. and thanks for joining us. And we'll go to David for an introduction and a background.
Okay, I'm David Mottram and I live in Lancaster, but have lived in Manchester in the past. There's a sort of short answer and a slightly longer answer to my involvement with GAA.
We've got time.
The short answer is that I went out with Paul in 1979 and 8. So in a sense, it was just part of life, obviously. But the slightly longer answer is I lived in London between 1976 and 1978. And was involved in gay activism there, I guess. I attended, for example, that National Defence Committee demonstration in Trafalgar Square in January 1978. But I then moved to Manchester. And one of the things I'd say, I think, is that I don't think of myself as specifically having been an activist in GAA, but in the late 70s, there were relatively small numbers of us doing things, and the same people were doing different things. So, for example, 2 previous speakers have referred to Manchester Friend, the advice befriending counselling service. I was also a member of Friend, and I would say in terms of time and energy given, that's probably the thing I most did. So that took quite a lot of effort, the telephone work, meeting people and so on, and supporting the work of the group. But I was also, from about 1980, quite involved in the Labour Party. And for example, through my local Labour Party in 1980, I proposed a motion that went through our constituency to the Labour Party conference, a very early example, I think, of a lesbian and gay party motion to allow party conference. It wasn't discussed, but it went there, which was something. So what I think I'd say is that I participated in some of the GAA events in Manchester, as others did. You know, for example, there was an episode at the Iranian consulate, not just the Greeks, but the Iranians, where people chained themselves to the rails outside Peter Stanley. And so I participated in those sort of things, but was involved in all sorts of campaigns, community support, things that were going on, as I think we all were. We all had multiple involvements and popped up in different places. And GAA, in a sense, was almost like a label. It was a way of describing lots of things that were happening, actually, independent actions and so on.
Yeah. So the work could vary from the kind of, you know, high octane zaps of railings and consulates, but also grassroots community work around. And so Friend would be about offering kind of one-to-one support and for people coming out. Is that the kind of work you did with Friend?
What Friend was doing, it was distinguished from the switchboard, which was principally driven by providing information, because information was a real issue, pre-digital, of course. So for people to phone and speak to another lesbian or gay man on a phone was quite something, since we were self-defined as that. So that was really important. Yeah. The switchboard could provide information and some basic advice, but Friend distinguished itself by actually being prepared to befriend people slightly longer term, and indeed to meet people. That was an important distinction. We met people and would talk them through issues and work with them. And the word counselling is a bit treacherous, really, but we did, you know, we tried to help to work for people to work through issues about coming out and provide some more sustained support.
Yeah, great, thank you. And for those who don't know, that the switchboard was a project that persisted and became the foundation. Is that correct?
I mean, Terry, talk about switchboard in your bedroom. Terry started in his bedroom. So
wow, Terry, thank you.
I was one of the group that started Manchester Switchboard. It started on the 2nd of January 1975 and grew out of a consortium of local groups, including the lesbian group, the CHE group, the gay SOC group. But no, what the Lesbian and Gay, now LGBT Foundation, it's changed its names a couple of times over the years, grew out of a separate health initiative. And indeed, much later, I forget which year, when the switchboard was having trouble staffing itself, the LGBT Foundation, if you like, took over the switchboard, the phone line, and offered that service. And I understand that now it's largely done by paid staff.
Thanks, Terry. And just sort of circling back to the bigger picture, I think one thing that it's really hard for any sort of historian to communicate is the culture at the time. And Paul and a couple of other people have mentioned, you know, there were no legal protections. Paul mentions that in the presentation. But I think it's probably difficult for younger people to really feel what it was like to have no gay representation on television, no public discussions about gay life, really. And in fact, active bans on those things at various times. No hate crime protection and not many public allies. And then all of the sort of the economic and social penalties of being a person who is out of the closet. And that sort of the texture of life for LGBT people is quite hard to communicate for those people who weren't there. Could I ask you, each of you, if you'd like to sort of reflect on, you know, on the culture of being an out gay person, let alone an activist in those times? Anyone who wants to jump in?
Could I just say,
yeah, please.
I love badges, so I had a whole host of badges. You know, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, those sort of things. But one I always had on my coat was called "Yes, I'm homosexual too." I mean, and I wasn't out where I lived as such, but there it was on my badge. One of my neighbours, I was very, very friendly with. I babysat her kids, and we were really friendly. And you know, it was a nice friendship. And her husband was from Mauritius, and he was fine with me until I was helping them move house. So I was carrying a wardrobe upstairs with him, and he saw the badge on my coat, and he banned me from the house. And you know, my kids couldn't understand, because her kids were younger than mine, but they did sort of play together. And my kids couldn't understand why they couldn't go around, because they'd moved house around the corner. And you know, that at the time it was, and she never stood up for me. She never stood up to him. I mean, obviously, I mean, having seen what relationships are like, obviously she perhaps couldn't stand up to him, you know, but it was very hurtful at the time.
Yeah, of course. And in terms of being a family with gay parents, how did you sort of communicate to the children, you know, that there are people out there who aren't going to be as accepting of us, and what were those?
Well, like I say, they grew up, well, not grew up with it, because they were a little bit older, but they got used to it, and they came to the gay centre. They came on all the pickets that were nearby that they could come on, you know, and they took part in. I took part in some survey, and my mind's, you know, totally gone blank about who did it and what it. But it was about that children of lesbians are in no greater danger of being gay or whatever than, you know, children of heterosexuals. So they talked to the kids over a period of about 3 years.
Yeah.
And I had no idea what the kids said to them, and you know, they spoke to them without me. And then they spoke to me, obviously, but they also spoke to their school. Both the girls, I think they were both at Whalley Range, and they talked to the school and the headmistress and things. So they grew up with it, and their friends, you know, were aware, and it didn't seem to bother them. And one of my daughter's friends in particular, she when they were out and about, and she'd say to her, said, "See them over there, look, 2 lesbians." and you know, Rachel would say to her, "Well, how do you know?" "Oh no, I can tell." So it was just, you know, we were, like I say, and I was lucky in that my family were totally and absolutely supportive, you know.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I had no problem at all with any of my family.
Right.
So
that's good to know. And would anybody else like to reflect on those aspects of those times?
What Anne's saying was, I mean, I think to all of us here is probably to an extent, everybody had stories like that, and I suspect there's quite a large proportion of much younger people these days who probably would find it shocking, would find Anne's story shocking, and yet it was not shocking at all. I did have minor problems with family around religious issues. So my mum was quite an evangelical Christian, and my homosexuality certainly caused her trouble within her church, and which came to a head, and there was talk of being exiled from the family until everybody else put their foot down and told the pastor to piss off. But that was a completely just a couple of days ago. I was at a cafe. I live in Spain. I'm in the mountains in southern Spain, and I was in a cafe. We're allowed to go to cafes at the moment. And I was talking to somebody, and they were talking. They'd been talking to their teenage children the night before, and my friend was saying, "Oh yeah, we were talking. They've been watching Russell Davies's It's a Sin," and the teenage kids found it extraordinary that there was a time when lesbians and gay people weren't allowed to marry.
Wow.
It was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And so when you recount and recall the deep repression, as there was, that we all just kind of took as normal, it seems it seems like from a different century, not just a couple of decades ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And anybody else like to?
I think I'd like to. The way I'd like to put it is that in that era, the messages from this, and this is the situation for many people in the world still, that the messages from the government via its discriminatory laws, age of consent of 21, pretty police in public toilets entrapping gay men, virtually all major religions overtly homophobic, the media, most of the media, overtly homophobic. I submit, for example, the Sun and Manchester Evening News using gay plague headlines in the mid-1980s, that if you like, the messages from everywhere, and that percolated down through society. So whether it was schools, health services, families, whatever, that the messages more often than not were overwhelmingly negative.
Yeah.
I think something I would like to say that is very clear visibly amongst the group this evening is, of course, a high proportion of the visible activists were men, not women, but also that, in fact, amongst the men, there were a cohort of us who shared a lot of characteristics, which is the first thing is we'd all gone to university. And there was quite as a group, I think we could identify quite strongly. We may have come from very different family backgrounds, but we'd had very recent life experience as students and coming out and so on. And we felt very confident ourselves to apply skills and campaign and be articulate and write press releases and go into political parties or into the streets. And Anne's experience is a really interesting corrective because it wasn't all that. It sometimes seems like all that because those people were very strongly represented amongst the people who had the time to go to weekend conferences, you know, maybe have jobs and some income and so on and so forth. There are different ways of thinking about it, but it's definitely true. And it's noticeable here that there is a coherent group of people of a particular generation, men in their 20s, who did quite a lot at that time. I'm not trying to say it was exclusively that, but I think we ought to acknowledge it.
Yeah. No, but we certainly weren't the most diverse bunch. We were all white as well.
Well, Kershad.
Well, yeah, good. Yeah.
I love it.
And so, I guess looking back at that presentation, what might strike other people who are new to this period is that the campaigning was sort of really joined up, what we might think about as intersectional now. So joining in with anti-racist and anti-fascism, the Anti-Nazi League, and also quite strongly connected with trade unionism and that kind of thing. Is it helpful for us to sort of think about the GAA as coming out of sort of active left-wing organising, or is it coming more out of the community and joining with those? How would you describe it?
I think for me, what's really interesting is that the Gay News Defence Committee was driven by Stephen G and John Lloyd, who were very involved in the Gay Liberation Front. So actually, it was very much more the Gay Liberation Front than CHE, the Campaign for Homosexual Equality. So I think it was very much from a left-wing perspective. And actually, in that time, it was sort of quite a radical thing. So a lot of people who got involved in GAA were already active and became active during the 1980s, certainly myself and other people here, in both the Labour Party and the trade union. So I think it was very much had a very radical perspective, really. So we talked at our meetings and in the newsletters, there's discussions around racism and capitalism, all sorts of things. It saw itself very much as part of a wider movement and trying to link it with Black liberation and women's liberation. So it was very much part of that, I think, with a very focus around activism and action, but trying to have a more coherent political strategy, although it didn't last very long, really sort of petered out after a while. But I think while it was effective, it was quite an interesting a sort of set of people involved in it, really.
Yeah.
And so can I ask you a quick question? Can I ask you a quick question? One of the reasons I wanted to come along tonight was because I wanted to find out, really, because I arrived out in Manchester after the GAA had really dissolved, but I never really knew why. I mean, when we were there in the early 80s in Manchester, when I arrived there in 83, 84, it was very obvious that this organisation had been important and it's super active. And all this, most of the people that we've been talking about this evening, most of them were still around, and they were all my colleagues. But I didn't actually know why did the GAA cease to exist as an organisation?
Very good question. Thanks, Andrew.
I don't know, actually. For me, because I've got all the newsletters. It started in '78, and there's about 8 or 9 newsletters, and it just seemed to finish. And actually, I can't remember, to be honest. I don't really know why. I think some of us got involved. David, I was talking just about David earlier on today, actually, but I think it's partly that a lot of us got involved in the Labour Party and trade unions, really, which is maybe more focused. I think we just ran out of energy. And the other thing to stress, which I want to stress, is what Anne was saying. It was actually great fun. It was a real close social network of people. It was an alternative to the gay scene. So it was lots of fun. And again, actually, in terms of meetings, we met people for relationships and for fun. So networking. It was a real social alternative to the gay scene. Yeah. Andrew can say about his Trotskyist hunts, really.
But when you're describing it, it reminds me of reading Maxine Wolf talking about ACT UP New York, which is running in parallel to these organisations, and she describes it as that combination of serious political organising and joyful living, which I thought was really lovely, way to summarise that kind of commitment. And
it was pretty grindy, you see.
Yeah, big grand, of course. And I was just thinking what you were saying, Paul, about the kind of the joined up struggle and the lateral thinking of activism at the time. And one of the cartoons that's featured in the newsletter, I think, has a speech bubble that says, "Sorry, comrade, but we need real men to fight fascism." So it sounds like part of the work is bringing homophobia in the left to task as well. Was that work that you had to spend time on as well?
Absolutely. I mean, other people can talk about. I went to a young militant conference and was told I was a bourgeois deviancy, basically, when we tried to raise gay rights. And again, it was really common that a lot of hostility. The other thing I was involved in, me and my friend Glyn were involved in. There was an anti-sexism group. I was in a men's group in Manchester with my friend Mark, but actually we got kicked out of the group because we were too gay, basically. So
though, rather than presenting the idea, it might sound like we all stop doing anything, which we know isn't the case, without kind of listing everything that all of us here were involved in. But I mean, to mention a few: Mancunian Gay, Gay Life, the Gay Centre, work in different parts of local government, being ready when Section 28 came along. It wasn't like when GAA stopped, we all stopped doing things, was it?
No,
we were busy we kind of kept going and were busy in our individual ways with a lot of initiatives.
But I think Peter Stanley did stop chaining himself to things, didn't he?
Yeah.
I think it's quite important, though, not to think of GAA as if it was some very formally constituted organisation, because in a sense, I think it was a sort of holding title to describe quite a lot of direct action campaigning at a particular time. And I think this often happens with community campaigns, that they rise and they fall. And GAA had its moments. It was very energetic and exhilarating to be involved in. And as Paul has told me from the newsletters, there were regular national meetings every 2 months at a weekend. The meetings would rotate around the country. That was quite exciting, but it was also quite difficult to maintain when people really wanted to put the energies into direct action. And I think, like a lot of these things, the energy was there and then the energy wasn't there, and it went into all the channels.
Yeah, of course. And I guess so when particular issues come around, Section 28 we mentioned, and then of course like HIV and AIDS before that those community networks and that organising skill and the telephone trees and the names and the faces that you need to build that movement are already there. And I really enjoyed the story, Paul, about the evangelical Christian event where James Anderton was speaking. And I should say that if you mention the words James Anderton in any public forum in Manchester today, you will still get a boo. So the shadow is long. Yeah, the shadow is long for that period. But can you talk a little bit more about how you would come up with the idea for the Zaps and where to target and how to do it, and just what the emotions are about going through quite a public, intense demonstration like that one?
I mean, I think, well, the thing that strikes me is that I used to wear a Yes, I'm Homosexual too badge all the time as well, which I can't believe I used to do, really. Everyone wore badges and it was so open, really. So I think we were quite... we were young and we were full of energy. We were quite upfront about doing things, really. The thing about the Andertons Act, we sort of, there was a precedent that the suffragettes had actually done a similar thing. They'd unfurled a banner at an event at the Free Trade Hall. So we did do that, and we sort of tried to disguise ourselves as like married couples. So that was a particular event. And it was, the thing that I remember is that the sort of, it was a very violent response. We got Bibles chucked at us and we were bundled out, really. That's what I remember, Anne. I mean, I know you were there as well, Anne. I don't know what you remember about it, Anne, but it was quite a big event, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was packed. The Free Trade Hall was packed, wasn't it? To the rafters. And he was speaking, and then, I'm not sure, I think I might have been one of the people who unfurled the banner. And there was about 5 of us to drop it over the balcony. And then all hell broke loose. and we, you know, but like I say, it was fun. We made our mark. We said our piece. Whether they wanted to hear it or not, they did hear it. So, you know, it was good fun. It was.
I'm going to wrap up fairly soon. I just wondered for the last couple of minutes if there are any particular memories or questions like Andrew had, or anything you'd like to share following on from the presentation.
I'd just like to add, Greg, that at the time we didn't know what the future held. We hoped, but it wasn't certain, and there were times where, certainly speaking personally, I felt really depressed about the future. You know, it's I don't think we should ever forget that at that time, it would appear that there were so many institutions against us, and yet Clause 28 and Section 28. I think that was that 89, and then by the time that the Blair government came in 97, there were big changes in such a short period of time. It was almost unbelievable, you know.
And I think that's a good lesson for younger organisers and activists who are watching this, that at the time you don't know what the impact always of the work that you're doing is going to be, and that not knowing the future is, you know, it weighs heavy. But when we've seen sort of the domino effects that change has, especially for the LGBT community, that nothing is wasted and that energy always goes somewhere. And I hope that that encourages the young organisers who are watching. And on that note, and that positive note, I just want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us and sharing memories. And hopefully this project will run on some more. So this won't be the last reunion, but suffice to say thank you to David, to Anne, to John, to Terry and Andrew, and most of all thanks to Paul, not only for this wonderful project, but for everything that you do, and to all of you, a huge thank you from Superbia and from Manchester Pride. And thank you very much for joining us. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.